All right, Cristal, I think we're going to go ahead and get started just to be mindful of everybody's time here. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. We are going to be listening to Cristal, a career and industry specialist from the Career and Professional Development Services, talk to us today about crafting your application. So welcome, Cristal.
Yeah, thank you. I'm joining you all to talk about crafting your application. My name is Cristal, and I use pronouns she, her, hers, and ella. So as an overview for our conversation today, we'll talk about identifying a goal, career competencies, resumes, cover letters, and then other types of materials that you might encounter whenever you're building an application packet. So we'll get started with identifying a goal, right? It's always a really good idea to make sure that when you are engaging in really anything, right? When you are maybe planning to start applying to graduate school or planning to apply to jobs or internships, volunteer work, whatever it might be, right? You want to sort of start with that end goal in mind. And it's always really helpful, right, to start there too, because you can sort of center yourself, right? Whenever you feel like I am moving through this process a little too quickly, or maybe I'm moving through this process a little too slowly, or maybe I am looking at positions that don't interest me, or I'm looking at other positions that do interest me, but I maybe don't have the qualifications to be able to engage in those just yet. It's always helpful, again, to start by identifying that end goal. So to get started, you'll start obviously with your goal in mind, right? And then you'll move into looking at some of the descriptions for the opportunities that you are interested in applying for. There's a couple different pieces that you will want to pay a special attention to, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. But again, you're looking at those descriptions. And then you're also thinking about your audience, right? So who is going to be looking at your application materials? Are they, top level executives? Are they someone who's going to be managing you? Is it an HR team that's going to be reviewing your documents? If you're applying for research opportunities, will it be deans and faculty members, right? It's really important that you are also considering the industries, right, that you're interested in as well. So what this means, right, is thinking about maybe any industry-specific language, right, that you're going to be including in your application materials as well. So that does bring me to the career competencies. The career competencies are the 8 skills, right, or competency areas that NACE, which is the National Association for Colleges and Employers, has kind of identified as these key pieces that employers are really looking for in future candidates. So from left to right here, in no particular order, we have critical thinking, communication, leadership, technology, career and self-development, teamwork, professionalism, and equity and inclusion. So a couple things that I want to point out here with the career competencies is that you do not need to move through these in any particular order, right? You don't have to start with critical thinking and end with equity and inclusion, right? The reality is that we actually flex each of these different competencies at different points in our preparation, right? Through internships, volunteer work, part-time jobs, whatever it might be. But you all will want to make sure that you're able to communicate how you use each of those career competencies through your application materials, like your resume and your cover letter.
So going off of what Cristal had just said, as a working learner, you all should be engaging with these competencies throughout the Canvas pathway and really working on building off of these with your professional stories. So before we go further into this presentation, I would like to ask for you all as working learners to give an example of how you might show one of these competencies on your resume. Again, you guys should all be familiar with these and hopefully have started working on at least one, if not several of these competencies. So if you would like to come off mute and share a quick example of how you might show one of these competencies on your resume or throw it in the chat, that would be great. Just a few moments in case anybody's typing away in the chat box.
I would say, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Gabriella.
Great. I would say leadership, like on my resume, I know anytime I hold a position anywhere, like I always make sure to include that so they know that I have like leadership skills.
Absolutely, and that's a great example. leadership is always a big one. And I do think that that's a strong example, Gabriella, to include on your resume. Thank you for sharing.
I would use teamwork. I work in a team of 3 and we communicate a lot and collaborate. So definitely like to show that off.
Absolutely. And thank you, Aaliyah, for sharing as well. Teamwork is another great example. Obviously, all 8 of these are fantastic examples, but being able to collaborate and work as a team is always a good thing to highlight on your resume. Cristal, we can go ahead and continue on. Thank you, Gabriella and Aaliyah, for sharing.
Alrighty, so it's moving to tailoring your application materials. So I just talked about how important it is to mind your audience, right? To consider who it is that you're speaking to. Tailoring your application materials is one of the ways that we sort of demonstrate, right? That we've done our research, that we've looked into who's going to be potentially looking at our application materials. We are demonstrating, right, that we really thoroughly, right, moved through the position description, the job description, the opportunity description, whatever it might be, right? So that's your first step here. You want to make sure that you are thoroughly moving through and reading the description for whatever opportunity you're applying for. Right, you're looking for a couple of key details. You're looking for language, right, that you can be including in your application materials. You're looking for the skills that they are hoping for you to have, right? So usually on a description, they'll have, like minimum qualifications, right? So your application materials should describe how you've used at least those minimum qualifications, right? A lot of them will also have, what are they called? Kind of like additional qualifications, right? There's usually a piece there that kind of help you stand out, right? Also throughout the application process. So if you have experience within any of those, you'll want to make sure you're highlighting that or circling that language so that you can be including that type of that wording essentially in your application materials. Now, one thing that I do want to specify, right, is we can absolutely use the descriptions for the things that we are applying to inspire our application materials. What we do not want to do is copy and paste language, right? The people that are reviewing your application materials are most likely the people who wrote the descriptions, right? So they want to make sure that you are being thoughtful about how you're connecting your previous experience to this opportunity. So we're not copying and pasting language, but we are using that language to inspire our own documents. And then we're also looking at the industry, right? So if there are any industry trends potentially, right, then you can bring into your application materials. Maybe you notice that communication is really, really important for photographers, right? I'm just using that as an example here, but you'll want to make sure that you talk about how you've used communication in the past, right? You'll also want to make sure that you do a really good job at conducting research on the websites for each of those different potentially, right, employers, research groups, whatever it might be, nonprofit organizations. If you're looking at volunteering, whatever it is, you'll want to make sure that you're looking at their mission statement, at their vision statement if they have one, any goals that they outline in their websites as well, right? It's also important that if you do have any conversations with folks from those organizations beforehand, that you're making note if you hear someone sort of repeating similar language. So I'll just use an example here. In my initial conversations for my position right now, right, I heard multiple different people use this language around creating a career ecosystem at ASU, right? So I made sure that when I was having my conversations and my interviews that I talked about being inspired by a career ecosystem, right? And that's the language that I made sure to include because I had heard so many people say that before too, right? So that's just some of the ways that we will use our opportunity description and the industry to figure out our verbiage for our application materials. So typical application materials. Today we'll focus a good amount on resumes and cover letters, references as well. But some other pieces might be transcripts, especially for those of you who might be interested in applying for research opportunities or for graduate school, fellowships, right, that kind of thing. Samples of your work are pretty common. For those of us who are interested in going to a communication field, Samples of your work are usually a part of that application process. And then a personal statement or a statement of purpose. Personal statement is essentially your opportunity to describe how your interests, career goals, and experience align well with whatever program you're applying to. Where a statement of purpose is more of a document describing how your experience, interests, and career goals would work together with the goals of this program. It's for you to create an impact essentially within the industry. So they're a little bit different. We do have some handouts on our website that help with each of these different application materials, which we'll share a little bit later in the presentation. So jumping into resumes, if we could either unmute or in the chat here, answer, why might you need a resume?
To get an interview.
Yeah, awesome. Absolutely. So oftentimes they're a part of that application process, right? More often than not, they're a part of the application process, which leads you to get an interview. Absolutely. What else?
We had somebody type in the chat to get a job.
Yeah, absolutely right. To get a job. A resume is an opportunity for you to describe all of your related experience for a specific opportunity. So obviously, whenever you're applying for jobs, you want to make sure that you're presenting this document so that they can review your previous experience. Awesome.
Any other examples before we move on from this one? I think we may be good, Cristal.
Yeah, awesome. One thing that I do want to add here is oftentimes, right, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but for references, right, whenever you're asking for someone to kind of vouch for your previous experience, oftentimes they'll ask for your resume as well, just to see how it is that you're presenting yourself throughout that application as well. So formatting your resume, I would definitely encourage you all, if you're able to take a screenshot of this slide or take a picture of it with your phone, just so that you have it. But whenever you are formatting your resume, you want to stay away from templates, right? So we have a couple sample resumes on our website, and I'm sure you've seen a couple samples in other areas too. These are not templates, right? These are a resume that was created on a blank Word document that you can definitely use to, again, inspire your own documents. But a template is, you know, some of the things that you might see on Word, or even I think Google Docs has a couple different resume templates. Canva absolutely has resume templates. So we want to make sure that we're staying away from them, right? As pretty as they are, as colorful as they can be, templates actually sometimes make it really difficult to read your application, to read your resume, because they go through, oftentimes they'll move through this sort of like a processor that will pull like key language maybe that you've used or whatever it might be. And sometimes those templates can kind of scramble our language. So we'll stay away from templates. Whenever you are building your document on Word or on a blank Google Doc, you'll want to make sure it is in black and white. You're using single space, right? Because you know, you want to make sure that you have enough space to describe all the different things that you've engaged in. Your margins should be 0.5 to 1 inch margins. It should also be in an easy to read font. So I want to jump into this just a little bit. There are serif fonts and there are sans serif fonts, right? Arial is a sans serif font, I believe. But essentially, right, the difference is fonts that have that little tail. So like Times New Roman has a little tail at the end of it. Calibri, right, does not have that little tail at the end of it. So you'll want to make sure you're sticking with fonts that don't have just like little extension at the end of their T's or G's or whatever it might be, mostly because it makes it more accessible, right? And again, if you do have your resume printed for whatever reason, oftentimes having fonts that are easy to read can make it easier, obviously, if it's in print as well. Your name should be 14 to 16 point size, and it should not be any larger than this. It can be bolded though. If you feel like your name isn't standing out too much on your resume, you can go ahead and bold it. And then the rest of your resume should be between 10 to 12 point size. So oftentimes for like headers, right, you might make this a bit of a larger font, and then the actual like accomplishment statements that you use to describe your experience they can be in 10. The one thing that I do not recommend though is having your headers in 12, your position in 11, and then the description in 10, right? You want to stick to 2 fonts for the body of your resume, and then 14 to 16 for your header. Any questions on the formatting of a resume? Because I know there's some nuances too that come with building a resume.
I have a question. How important is it to keep your resume as one page, especially for applying for a job?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So I will say it's pretty standard to stick to 1 page. Someone a long time ago told me that if the president can create a 1-page resume, you can too, right? So I would definitely recommend staying to 1 page as much as possible. There is some variation within specific industries, but for the most part, it's really important that you stick to that 1-page resume. If you do need it, like absolutely need a second page, you want to make sure that it can fill the entire second page. And if it can't, then I would encourage you to kind of reflect on some of the experiences that you're describing on your first page and pull back a little bit if you need to. There's a ton of like small tips and tricks, that you can do to make your text fit better on a page. If you're struggling or if anybody is struggling to get that to 1 page, I would start by decreasing your margins first, and then look at decreasing your or changing your font. Excuse me. Arial is a pretty large font, so if that's the problem for you, you might want to use something like Calibri Light because it's like a skinnier, sort of thinner font, and it's still really easy to read. That's a good question. Any other questions? All right. So we will move to contact information. So on the very top of your resume, you always want to make sure your name is the very first piece of information, right? I'm not sure if I've said this just yet, but a resume is, again, a document that exemplifies all of your relevant experience, right? And anything that's highly relevant. This is your resume, so your name is arguably the most relevant piece of information on your resume. So you want to make sure that's the first text that you see there. Both of these examples have it bolded. So they've also included their LinkedIn as well, with that tail end of their LinkedIn account edited, or of their LinkedIn URL edited, right? So that it's their first and last name. You've got a phone number here. One thing to remember is you want to make sure that your phone number, has your voicemail set up as well, and that there's space in your voicemail box too, right? The last thing that you want is someone to give you a call and them not be able to connect with you because your voicemail box was full. I'm speaking from personal experience here. It was very embarrassing that they weren't able to connect with me. And then you also want to make sure you include your email. So one thing that I get a lot, or a question that I get a lot here is, should I be using my ASU email or should I use another email? Honestly, it's completely up to you. If you're applying to something like at ASU, then I would encourage you to put your ASU email, mostly because it shows that you're already connected, right, at ASU. If you're applying to an opportunity outside of ASU, it's totally fine to use a different one if you'd like. I have like a professional Gmail account that's just my first and last name that I've used for all of my applications, and mostly that helps me too, because anytime that I need to go back and see, like, what did I say to this person when I applied to that internship a couple years ago, I can jump back into that email easily, right, and see my previous communication with them. Another thing too is after you all graduate, there are obviously like updates that happen regularly to your ASU accounts, right? One of those being password changes. So if you miss that password change, you might not have as easy access to your ASU email account. That's just something to keep in mind. But again, these are just 2 separate examples. If you are kind of crunched for space, I would suggest using this first example at the top here. And then if you have a little more space and you want to take up some more room, then I would use this second example here. So now in the chat, or you're definitely more than welcome to unmute as well. I'd love to hear from maybe 3 people about your thoughts on this header here. So we looked at this previous header, now we're looking at this one. what are some changes that we could make to maybe, or what's some feedback that we can provide for Leo so that he can adjust his header?
Edit his LinkedIn URL.
Yeah, absolutely. So editing the LinkedIn URL. One thing I think is really funny about Leo is that he did go in and edit it. He decided that Leo the Lion would be the best choice and then kept all those numbers. Again, first and last name is appropriate for the tail end of your LinkedIn account. Yeah, awesome. Thank you. I see in the chat here too, someone else agreed that LinkedIn profile URL should be changed. And then I got another message saying a more professional email. Yeah, I mean, Leo might be the best, right? But he will want to make sure that he uses an email that has his first and last name here as well. A couple other pieces. Oh, another comment is that if the phone number doesn't have an area code, yeah, you'll want to make sure that you include your area code in your phone number as well. Leo should have also included his last name, right? So that we know who Leo is. And then about this address as well. So Leo has gone ahead and provided his street address, his apartment, the city, state, and zip. Only including the city, state, and zip is completely appropriate. The reality is, it's common practice to include I'll say, common practice to include your entire resume, or your entire address, on your resume, because that's where you receive correspondence, right? But now, for the most part, folks use a phone number or a LinkedIn or even your email, right? So we don't need that full address. So Leo could go ahead and remove his apartment number and his street address and just keep Tempe, Arizona, and that's it as well. Moving to education.
Real quick, Cristal, I did see somebody just threw in the chat too. They mentioned that Leo's name was not in a 14 to 16 point font size. And I thought that was a good catch.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's also not bolded too. So yeah, really good point. This text is gigantic. So yeah, he should definitely be decreasing that to between 14 to 16. Moving to your education section. So as I mentioned, right, you want to make sure you're including all the most relevant pieces of information on your resume that includes your education, because you're ASU students, right? That's the most recent, most relevant thing that you've engaged in at ASU. So you want to make sure your education section is right after your header, right at the top of your resume. You'll list your major, right? And one thing you'll notice here is that there are no abbreviations used, with an exception of GPA that is abbreviated, which is completely appropriate. But this student has gone in and written out Bachelor of Science in Marketing. They included their graduation date, their expected graduation date, which is May 20 something. And they've also included their minor. So a minor in fashion and their GPA. A couple tips about that GPA. If you all are interested in STEM fields, a competitive GPA for things like internships, scholarships, research opportunities is going to be closer to a 3.5. For everybody else, right, everybody who's interested in more liberal sciences, a 3.5 is perfectly fine to include on your resume. And then I just included here as an example, but this student is a Barrett student as well. This is how you would display it if you're a Barrett student. And then they've gone and said Arizona State University, Tempe, Arizona. So for those of us who have Arizona State University listed first on our resumes, you'll want to go ahead and swap that. Degree first, and then you'll list the institution. And then the student also listed their city and state. Any questions on the education?
Cristal, is it important for the students to have their degrees bolded? Or is that something that it doesn't really matter, or should the university be bolded?
Yeah, really good question. So the degrees should be bolded. The institution does not need to be bolded. So one thing that you can always do on your resume is kind of play with bolding, italicizing, and underlining. Underlining less of, but mostly italicizing and bolding to emphasize text, right? So like here, if this student wanted to italicize Arizona State University to show like, hey, look at me, this is my institution, right? Then they could definitely do that. Or you don't need to also, but as long as it's consistent, right? So if you're going to italicize Arizona State University here, you need to italicize Arizona State University everywhere that it's listed on your resume. Whenever it's in a header in this way. If it's like within your accomplishment statement, you would not italicize that, just to clarify.
I have a longer title for my like major,
Yeah.
so like tends to take up that entire line and like go into a separate line. Is that okay, or should I like simplify Bachelor's of Science to be like a BS?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you'll want to still make sure you write out BS for your major. That's totally fine if it goes down to a second line. What's your major, if you don't mind me asking?
So it's kind of weird where it's like Earth and space exploration, but then like in parentheses it's astrobiology and biogeosciences.
Okay. So one thing that you could do is do Earth and space exploration here on the first line, and then hit enter, and then in parentheses you would put the that emphasis.
Okay.
So, yeah, good question.
Thank you.
And then I see in the chat we have, should we always have Tempe, Arizona? So you'll list whatever college, whatever campus your college is sort of like housed out of. If that's kind of confusing, because I know for like, WP carries on a couple different campuses and that kind of thing, then you can list Tempe. But truthfully, as long as you're listing that location for your major, there's not a huge difference. That's a good question though. So moving to experience, whenever you all are describing your experience, you want to make sure that you do it in accomplishment statements, which is just kind of like fancy language for a really thought out bullet point, right, on your descriptions for your positions. So that always starts with an action verb, right? And you'll want to make sure that this is like an active action word that almost describes the activity that you engaged in, right? So we'll stay away from language like worked, assisted, helped, I don't know, those kind of words that don't necessarily say like I was contributing to this task in this way, right? So some of the language that we can use is collaborate or communicate, coordinate, right? Because all of those are kind of like, they're definitely verbs, but they're also words that describe a task. You'll also talk about the project that you completed, and then you always want to make sure you include the result. The result is a really good opportunity to also quantify your work as well. We'll see a couple different examples of that. But what I mean by quantify is, if you regularly connect with 30 customers, there's a huge difference between 30 and 5, right? So you'll want to say, I connect with 30. You wouldn't use I, but you'll just say connect with or work with 30 different customers, communicate with, whatever it may be. So here we have an example of a student who is a barista at Starbucks Coffee Company in Phoenix, Arizona. And then they also listed their dates here. So we'll want to adjust this just a little bit, right? I talked about those action verbs that don't necessarily discuss how you contributed to a specific task. That includes took, ordered, right? This person also hasn't quantified their work either. So maybe at the base of their work is taking coffee orders for customers, ordering supplies and maintaining stock levels, resolving customer issues, so on and so forth, right? But what this person has done is gone through and listed the tasks that they engaged in, as opposed to the skills that they're building within those experiences. And so I'll use a different example of this student who is describing how they communicate with up to 300 customers during a 4-hour period in a fast-paced environment with successful delivery, right? That is very different from took coffee orders for customers, right? They're talking about how they're using communication, they're quantifying their experience, and they're also adding context for the environment that they're working in, right? Another thing to point out here is those verbs, right? Problem solved and negotiated, developed, troubleshot. Again, these are verbs that sort of describe the activity that you're engaging in. So I want to focus maybe on the formatting here. So we talked about bolding, right? How you can use bolded text to sort of bring attention to something. So the student has done that for their position. You always want to make sure that your position is listed first, and then the organization that you're working with, and then your location. So if you, this is just a tip for like if your position is super long or if the organization that you work with is super long, It could also be listed as barista here in that first line. And then in the second line, it could be Starbucks Coffee Company, right? And then we can shift Phoenix, Arizona to be right here, just under the dates as well. So you can move this around as long as it's consistent. You can definitely move around how you display your information. So now we'll jump into an activity. Abby's going to go ahead and put the link in the chat for y'all. But let's practice with writing accomplishment statements. So I want you all to think of a task or a responsibility, right? And then use the handout to convert this task that you completed into an accomplishment statement. And at the end, we'll go ahead and share out. You're more than welcome to put it in the chat here or unmute as well. But I'll give y'all about 3 to 5 minutes. We'll start with 3 and then see if we need more time.
And Cristal, while they're opening this and getting started on that, is this a document that they can find on the website with CPDS, or I will be including this in a follow-up email for everybody, but just for future notice, if they can't find that email, are they able to find it online?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So you all, I'll jump out of the full screen here. Can you all still see my mouse movement on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So if you go to the CPDS homepage, and then from there, jump to career resources here on the black bar. You can then go ahead and scroll down and hit helpful handouts. And that will bring you to the page on our website that houses like every single resource that is anywhere on our website, any printable resource that's anywhere on our website. And if you scroll down here under resumes and cover letters, we've got the accomplishment statements handout. There's also a few other handouts here too. So if you're struggling with the formatting a little bit with your resume, you can take a look at some of these different samples that we have. There's also a sample cover letter that you can take a look at. This page I really like. It's basically like 2 full pages of a ton of action verbs that you can include on your resume as well. Let's see, and then there is another document here, which I think is really helpful for cover letters specifically. This first page is more of like a checklist to just make sure that you've kind of taken care of all of these. This one here is more helpful for actually writing out your cover letter. Kind of breaks that down into a couple different questions for you. Thanks, Abby.
And again, for those of us here today, I will be including those links in a follow-up email so that you all will have access to those even after today. Do we have anybody that has been able to put an accomplishment statement together that is ready to share with the group? If not, that's fine. We'll give you just a few more moments here. And I do just want to point out too, I mean, this can be examples from your student position that you might be working in here at ASU. This can be from a job off campus. And if this is a first job that maybe you've just started working, you don't really have an example yet, you can pull an example from any class projects that you may have worked on. You can get creative in any way. Again, we do understand that a lot of students, this may be your first job. So any class projects would be a great example. And Cristal, you can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think those are equally strong points to have on a resume if needed.
Absolutely. For those of us too who like haven't had lots of opportunities to engage in other areas too outside of like part-time work or whatever it might be, I would even encourage you to, I mean, this is just practice, right? So you can even think back to high school and consider some of the things that you engaged in at that time too. We have an example here: standardized and implemented a program into our department's daily tasks that increase efficiency and organization. Good, really, that's honestly like super impressive. So good for you. That's
I
awesome.
was just going to say the same thing. That impressed me. So
Yeah.
that was a great example. Thank you, Aaliyah. We can get one more example. Again, you can either share it in the chat, or if you would like to come off of mute, you are more than welcome to unmute yourself and share an example.
Yep. If you're okay with it, Abby, in the interest of time, we can, you all are more than welcome to continue to add to the chat. I definitely would love to hear about your different tasks that you've engaged in, your accomplishment statements. But we will move on to different parts of the application packet. So as Abby mentioned, right, depending on your unique background, there are different types of sections that you can include on your resume too, right? Some of it is going to be the part-time work that you're doing currently, right, your student work. It could also be volunteer work. It could be class projects. You could be talking about things that you've done in internships, right? Research, whatever it might be. So some of those additional sections might be your relevant courses, community involvement, professional and student organizations, right? So if you're involved in any clubs on campus, internships, course projects, research, your thesis as well. If you're a Barrett student and completing a thesis, for a lot of us too, we have capstone projects, right, that you have to complete for your majors as well. That could definitely be included on here. Any technical skills that you have, and certifications and licensures. So I want to point out a couple things about those technical skills, right? Those are going to be anything that you either received training on, or that you've had to spend extensive amount of time learning that a platform or a software, whatever it may be, right? So that would include things like Microsoft Word or Google Workspace, right, which is Google Docs, presentation, that kind of thing. These technical skills are not things like communication, problem solving, that kind of thing. Those technical those skills you'll want to use to add to your accomplishment statements, right? And then for your relevant coursework, you'll want to make sure that you choose coursework that kind of adds to like a specialty that you've created for yourself. So maybe you're a psychology major, but you've taken a lot of classes on adolescence, potentially, right? Those adolescence courses are the ones that you'll want to talk about if you're applying for an internship, maybe as a behavioral analyst, right? So just to give you all an example there. And then as far as community involvement, this includes like your own home community, right? And any involvement that you have on campus as well. Any questions here? I know that a lot of us might be doing like certificates, right? So you can definitely be including your certificates on your resume as well. Those would actually go in your education section, so it'd be listed a little bit differently, but certifications would be things like a fingerprint clearance card if you work with kiddos, right? Or like CPR, first aid training if you have that kind of thing. A food handler's card you could also include on here. So moving to cover letters. In the chat, or again, you're welcome to unmute. What is a cover letter?
I've always used a cover letter to kind of give my, like, who's ever going to interview me more information about myself, and then highlight certain things on my resume and kind of go more in depth in that, rather than just showing them all my qualifications and like that I'm not like a real person.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely an opportunity to kind of show a bit more of like your own personality, right? Absolutely. So essentially, right, it's a document that you use to describe your interest in a specific opportunity. You're also using your cover letter to elaborate on the information that you have on your resume, right? So we are not taking information from our resume and just listing it in a cover letter, right? We're picking maybe 1 or 2 things that you engaged in from your resume to describe further in your cover letter, right? And it's also it's an introduction, right, to who you are, to your experience, to your interests, to your goals with that opportunity, right? Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
And I wanted to note on that too, again, with the Canvas pathway and how you all are utilizing the career competencies, you guys are all currently building a professional story, right? So you're taking great examples of the work that you're already doing and writing and articulating how that skill is being used in a professional sense. That is a great example, those professional stories. You can put that right there in your cover letter. So you're already kind of building your cover letter without realizing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And moving to some formatting pieces. So this might look familiar for you all, I hope it does. But this is the exact same header that is on your resume, right? So you'll want to use this exact same header on your cover letter as well. Essentially, when you're building an application packet, you want to make your documents look like they go together, right? And the easiest way to do that is by repeating the header on both documents. And moving to formatting, you'll want to use business letter format, right? So that includes like making sure you have your date listed. You'll want to list the recipient for your letter. And you're using like your regular greeting, right? That kind of thing. It should be between 3 to 4 paragraphs. So it's not super long, right? It's not it's not a personal statement. So it's not any longer than about 1 page. And then again, you're using that same header and the same font as your resume as well. Obviously font size is going to be a little bit different. I wouldn't encourage you to use like 10-point font on your cover letter. You might want to stick more to like 11 or 12 if you need the space. It's obviously smaller text if you need the space, but same font type.
Cristal, what about for the cover letters? Can I use a template for my cover letter? Are there templates for cover letters? Is that something I should stay away from?
Yeah, really good question. So we are not using templates for any of our documents. That includes cover letters. I'm sure there are templates for cover letters, but if you all use the handout that I shared earlier, and I'll go ahead and put it in the chat here again, that is essentially like the structure that you want to follow, right? Like those questions is what you'll want to follow with your cover letter. So jumping a little bit further into formatting, you'll always start with a greeting, right? So some good examples are Dear Mr. Doe, Dear Hiring Manager, Dear Search Committee, right? Some of the things that you want to stay away from is to whom it may concern and any casual greetings like hi, hello, what's up, right? Whatever it might be. So we're using a professional greeting. We're presenting ourselves, right, and approaching this individual with professionalism, right? And then I know that a lot of people really like to use to whom it may concern. It sounds really fancy, and I was one of the people who used to use to whom it may concern. But then at some point I got some feedback that basically said, when you're submitting an application material, your letter concerns like you. This is your letter, right? They don't need your application, right? Not necessarily that like you're not a valued applicant, but the reality is, right, this is the letter concerns you. So we'll stay away from to whom it may concern and use Dear Mr. Doe, Dear Hiring Manager, Dear Search Committee, so on and so forth. Jumping into that introduction, you'll want to start by stating the job or program that you're applying to. You want to make sure that you're demonstrating interest in the position, right? So this is where reviewing the description initially is really important. You want to state why you're a strong candidate, right? And you already did some of this work too on your resume, right? Your accomplishment statements hopefully speak to the position or to the opportunity that you're applying to. So you've already kind of described how you're a strong applicant and why do you want to work for that company or go to that school or engage in this opportunity, right? So this is you, like this is your genuine interest in why you're interested in this position. And then the body for your cover letter should really answer the question, why should they hire you or why should they accept you? Why should they offer you this opportunity? You're highlighting your relevant experience, right? So again, we might be pulling from an opportunity that we engaged in that we already described in our resume. You're mentioning your qualifications. So if you have any specific certifications that prepared you or any projects that you worked on that give you the skills that they talk about in the description, you'll want to include that. You'll also explain how you'll be an asset, right? So what makes you someone who can contribute positively to the environment that you're going to be working in? And you want to give specific examples as well, right? So it's not enough for me to say, I communicate well, right? I have to describe, I have regularly communicated with students, employers, faculty members, and professional staff, right? Maybe you can add and say that you have regularly communicated with a diverse group of students, or whatever it might be, but you just want to make sure you give an example, a concrete example of that. And for closing your letter, you always want to make sure you request an opportunity to interview or an opportunity to move forward within the application process. You'll list your contact information. So even though your contact information is already in the header, you'll list it again in your last line there. And you'll want to express gratitude and include any closing remarks as well. Some things that you don't want to do is end abruptly. So you do need a conclusion, even if it feels like your letter has come to an end kind of naturally. You'll want to make sure that you do close it out. You're avoiding casual goodbyes, like talk to you later, see you soon, that kind of thing. And you'll also avoiding any unprofessional attention grabbing statements like, let's cut to the chase, right? Again, this is a professional document, so you want to make sure that you're using professional language. Any questions about the cover letter? All right.
Cristal, I do have one quick one. I know that you had said avoid casual goodbyes, like talk to you later. What about one, something like look forward to hearing from you soon? Or is that a statement similar to that? Is that appropriate, or is that one that we should kind of steer away from?
Yeah, really good question. So that's completely appropriate. You can definitely, so maybe I can give an example here, right? You can say like, thank you so much for reviewing my application materials and for considering me as an applicant. Should you want to connect further to discuss my qualifications, here is my phone number and email. I look forward to connecting with you soon, or I look forward to hearing from you soon. That's absolutely appropriate. Yeah, good question. So moving to references, you always want to make sure that you ask your references before you list them as a reference on your applications, right? It's a huge surprise whenever someone gets an email and they're like, hey, can you talk about your previous work with this individual? And they're like, sure. And, so you want to make sure that you notify them first. Maybe you're also sharing your resume and cover letter with them too. Whenever you are sort of building, right, again, your packet, a part of that packet should be anywhere between 3 to 5 professional references, and then one of those can be academic. If you're doing research, right, I would probably suggest closer to 2 academic references and 1 professional reference, whatever it might be. You should also be listing your references on a separate page if you need to list those. And for the most part, you'll be asked to list them like within the application too. So oftentimes, honestly, you don't need to even list your references at all on your resume. That's one big piece to take away from this conversation is you do not want to waste the space on your resume listing references, right? So you can add that to a second page. And then you'll also always want to make sure that you're expressing gratitude, right? This person is advocating for you and why you deserve the opportunity that you're applying to, right? So you'll want to make sure that you thank them as well.
So I did just get a message to when putting your reference information, is it appropriate to put their phone number, or is that something you leave off and they can request that from you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I always start off by saying, I would love for you to serve as a reference for me. If this is something that you feel comfortable doing, can you please give me a good phone number? So like a phone number that you can be reached at and an email. Whenever you are listing those references, you'll want to list that person's first and last name and their title, right? If they're like a faculty member and they have a PhD, right? You want to make sure you call them Dr. So-and-so first and last name. You also want to make sure you include your relation to them, right? So were you a student, or did they supervise your work, or whatever it might be. And then you'll list your phone number and email as well. So that all gets asked for in that very initial sort of conversation about the references. Yeah, good question. So moving to some of those additional application materials that I talked about, those are going to be transcripts, right? Really common for grad programs, fellowships, research opportunities, samples of your work as well. And then I mentioned a statement of purpose briefly. And again, that is included in that handout that I shared.
And hopefully you all would have a great example of your work as being a working learner. One of your first steps within our foundation module was to create that digital portfolio. So hopefully you all are continuing to add your work to that digital portfolio, and that is constantly being updated with your most recent samples of that work. So that should just be an easy tool that as a working learner, you're already designing and have ready to go. So feel free to include that in your application materials.
A little piece that I wanted to add here too, whenever you're requested transcripts, you can submit unofficial transcripts, just so you know, because sending official transcripts sometimes has like a fee associated to it. So you are definitely welcome to share unofficial transcripts, which you can get from your My ASU accounts. So your final review, right? You've taken all this time to develop your resume, to develop your cover letter, right? To create this really curated, individualized application packet. So before you submit it, you want to make sure that you get it checked, right? So you want to, you can definitely connect with the Writing Center to check your grammar. You can ask mentors or your friends, family members, supervisors, right, to review your application materials too. You'll want to make sure you're staying away from abbreviations and acronyms. And the main reason for this is because you might be doing something that within the scope of your work makes a lot of sense. I'll use CPDS as an example, right? To me, CPDS immediately means Career and Professional Development Services. To somebody else, CPDS can mean something entirely different, and all of a sudden they've lost context for what my work is, right? You also want to make sure that you're using key phrases and words, right? Again, we're thinking back to the research that we started with. What were some of those words that they wanted me, or that you should be using? What are some of the skills that they wanted you to have, right? You're including all of that. And then again, you're having someone else review your documents. Like I mentioned, this can be friends, family, mentors, really anybody, but I always try to shoot for like between 3 to 4 people reviewing your application materials. Just because the more eyes that you can get on it, the more feedback that you can get, the better for you in the long run. Now, whether you implement everybody's feedback is completely up to you, but it's nice to just have their perspective. Any questions? And I do want to leave you all with this prompt here to name one thing that you all will do in the next 24 hours to put you on the path to success. You definitely don't need to share it with me now, but I do definitely encourage you all though to think about what's one thing. Is it going to be maybe taking a look at your resume and see if the formatting is like what we described today? Are you maybe starting a search potentially, right? And you're going to start highlighting some of those keywords that come up on those descriptions. Whatever it might be, whatever you need to do for yourself. I always find that breaking up this sort of like larger task into smaller bite-sized pieces, it's easier to move through something like an application packet, which can take a good amount of work.
I will say, Cristal, me personally, I will be looking back at my resume and double checking because I know I definitely have lots of color throughout my resume, and I should probably make that all black and white. So that's something that I will be double checking on my own personal resume.
Yeah. Yeah, that actually does remind me of one detail that I wanted to mention too, is photos. A lot of us have photos of ourselves on our resumes. I will say that is common practice, oftentimes like internationally. Within the States, you do not need to include a photo of yourself. And in fact, I encourage you to not include a photo of yourself in your resumes. Awesome. Well, here is our contact information. You're more than welcome to email us, to give us a call, or obviously find us online. And then I just remembered that I was going to put this link here in the chat for y'all as well.
Well, thank you so much, Cristal, for spending some time with us today and really helping us understand what we should or should not have in our resumes and our cover letters. If anybody has any questions and would like to ask Cristal now, we do have just a few moments before our time is up. Otherwise, I will be sending the recording from this Zoom session to you all so that you have this to reflect back on. And of course, some of those handouts Cristal had, I will include in that email as well. If you do not have any questions, you are free to go and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again for joining us.